So, you've got a cool world, maybe a magic system, some characters and places, but who actually occupies this world you've made? That's where World Building Cultures comes in. Before we get started, I just want to say a massive thank you to all the newcomers who've been arriving at this channel. We've recently doubled in size in a really short period of time, and that's just kind of crazy. But your continued comments and your feedback have been wonderful to read, and I appreciate all of it. So back to the topic of cultures, this video should apply to you whether you're working on a book, tabletop RPG, or any other world building project. This can also apply in the sense of cultures as different members of the same species, like Imperials or Nords in Skyrim, or across species like humans, elves, and dwarves. One thing that makes cultures fairly unique as a topic is that while I will have a step-by-step process, you can tackle this in pretty much any order, so long as you cover the topics I'll be mentioning. But let's get started. Step 1. Appeal and purpose. When world building cultures, there's often going to be a key concept or need within your world that this culture is meant to embody or play a part in. Starting with that concept in mind will help shape every other step, which is why I've put it first. But what exactly is an appeal or purpose? When asking yourself this question, think of it almost like a character selection screen for a video game or tabletop RPG, even if that isn't what you're making. What is it about this culture that would make someone in that scenario choose it? Do these people occupy an interesting place, such as underwater domed cities or within a nigh impossible to reach mountain range? Perhaps they have the most advanced technology in the region, or maybe they're newly emergent after some sort of societal upheaval. As you can guess already, the appeal can be literally anything, but ultimately it answers the fundamental question of why does this culture exist in my world on a meta level? An example from media is, as mentioned a little earlier, the Nords of the Elder Scrolls series. Within the context of Skyrim, their purpose is to be the source of the rebellion between the Nord Stormcloaks and the Cyrodiilic Empire. While there's plenty more to them than that, that conflict is the central reason that they exist as the main culture in that game. An example from my own writing is the Skari. So how would I sell them to you? Well, I'd say they are heavily Viking-inspired Northlanders who live on frozen islands only kept habitable via the maintaining of ancient magic that creates temperate conditions within the bounds of their cities. They cannot reproduce this magic easily, and so in times of overpopulation or in hopes of gathering resources that might allow them to expand, they raid the more populous lands to the south. Fundamentally, the sell is that they are Vikings adapted to a fantasy environment with an in-universe pragmatic reason to act like Vikings. What is their purpose for existing? I chose them as an example as they are not the culture that the story I'm writing actually centers on, so the answer isn't the obvious because the main character is one of them. Instead, the Skari exist because 1. They play a part in one of the protagonist's backstories, 2. They act as a consistent threat and source of tension for the protagonists while also shielding them from the rest of the outside world by being hostile to other newcomers to the region, and 3. They are interconnected with many of the other cultures in the region. I will also say that you can have cultures that exist to be protagonist-y or antagonist-y, but big caveat, unless you're dealing with non-sentient beings, it is crucially important to remember that even if a culture upholds destructive values, it does not mean individuals within it must hold true to those values. The same can of course be said the other way around. Just because you have a group of good guys doesn't mean that there shouldn't be bad people within that culture. Every person is an individual, and while shaped by their culture, can always choose to reject it for better or worse. Ultimately, coming up with the appeal and purpose of your culture should be easy, as it's probably what's given you the idea for whatever culture it is you're making anyway, but your mileage may vary, and working out the thesis of your culture will make every following step a lot easier. Next is step 2, aesthetic. This will be closely tied in with step 1, as you might guess, as often the aesthetic is part of the appeal. The aesthetic step is definitely easier if this is a non-human culture, as the aesthetic is at least partially sold by their non-human nature. This isn't to say that your dwarven culture has to act like all other fantasy dwarves, but some legwork has already been done for you. The audience has a bit of an idea of what to expect when they see a dwarf, even if yours will be very different, and when working with humans, you really need to consider the often proclaimed maxim, humans in fantasy are boring. And that, my friends, cannot be further from the truth if you do humans right. And who does humans right? Well, I would say the Empire of Warhammer Fantasy does.
But Jay, Pat, they're literally just called the Empire. How can they be interesting?
Well, just take a look at this And tell me that looks like a generic fantasy human to you. No, the Empire of Warhammer Fantasy took the idea of the Renaissance Holy Roman Empire, smashed it together with a fanaticism for Sigmar and steampunk technology, and made a culture that relies on only three things: faith, steel, and gunpowder. Overall, making humans boring is a huge pitfall in fantasy and may actually be my main turnoff from fantasy universes. I often like human factions, but if they aren't engaging and distinct, I'll lose interest pretty quickly. So, what do you do whether your culture is human or not? As the old saying goes, there is nothing new under the sun. Our concept of culture only exists in the context of real human cultures, so even the most far-flung non-human culture you can think of still carries a real-world influence. That isn't to say fantasy vampires are literally just Romanians, but you're always drawing from somewhere. So what I'd say is pull up from the source, at least a little bit. Pull too closely from another fantastical medium and you may end up more derivative than you'd like. Instead, look to real historical cultures and then either stick very close to them or take bits and pieces and make new things. Both approaches are interesting, but also have their own challenges. The first approach can help you make a very authentic feeling culture with real historical relevance. With my Norn Skari, I've spent a lot of time reading into Old Norse culture to try and ground them in reality fairly tightly. While they exist in a fantasy world, I want them to feel real, not like your typical horned helmet, naked barbarian fantasy Vikings. The challenge, of course, is you are representing real people, even if they are of a culture that no longer exists. Do your research and try to understand the context they lived in and why they were the way they were. With the second approach, you can make something that'll feel newer and fresher and be something of a mystery to be unwrapped by your viewers. However, go too alien and they may be harder to relate to or understand. If that isn't your goal, then that can be fine, but it is worth considering. It'll also be a fair amount of work to pull such divergent ideas into one coherent culture, but of course it can be done. Next is step 3, daily life. This is about the stage where you start to think about the more day-to-day things. What sets this culture apart from the others on a societal or individual level? What are the holidays? What are the religious practices? What are the individual mannerisms or etiquettes that these people might demonstrate? The level to which you should focus on this really depends on how much time you'll be spending with this culture, but it is worth thinking about the little details like this, as this is the step that will most make your cultures feel distinct. If a reader or player can tell apart what culture someone is just from the way they speak, that means you're succeeding at making them be distinct. Don't resort to stereotyping, of course, but guidelines can help. A fun example of this is the Gorons from The Legend of Zelda. It's a little thing, even a little bit silly, but the Gorons often end their sentences by calling Link Goro. It's just a little cultural tick that you notice and might wonder about, and that bit of wondering makes them just that little bit more fun. For our Norn Skari example, they celebrate holidays that are tied to the runic magic that they study. Each of the dozen or so runes has its own holiday, several of whom are dedicated to the deities that taught them said rune. Runeblut, or the Day of Gwodalir, the rune god, is the greatest of their holidays for that reason. The Norn Skari try to maintain eye contact consistently, are direct in their speech, and are straightforward to the point of rudeness even with those outside their culture. Plenty of them may not follow these rules. As said, they are just guidelines. With adding details to a people's daily life, you can really work to make your culture's people feel real. And that's the greatest thing you can achieve when world building a culture. The last part is step 4, outside relations. With the exception of North Sentinel Island, no culture exists in total isolation. Even cultures that are very distinct from their neighbors will still share certain things in common with their neighbors, and those intertwined relationships are the final step in making a culture feel real. Just because you cross a border from country A to country B doesn't mean all of a sudden everyone acts entirely like country B people and not at all like country A people. Of course, as distances increase, differences between cultures will grow greater up to the point of complete dissimilarity, but two nearby cultures should push and pull against one another. Since we've been talking so much about Vikings, we could discuss the real-world example of how the Norse came down to the lands of modern-day Russia and Ukraine to help found the Kievan Rus, and thus Norse and Slavic culture became intertwined to a degree. In my universe, my Slavic equivalent, the Kievi, have dealt with incursions from the Norn Skari, both peaceful and otherwise, and so there is a cultural exchange there, particularly in terms of language. The language of Kiev and Norinskar are more similar than between Kiev and its western neighbor Bastaria. However, Kiev is still influenced by that western neighbor due to its proximity. Kiev and Bastaria have the same dominant religion. This line of thought and connection can carry on ad infinitum, but it goes to show how complex cultures can be, and it is at its most complex when they interact with one another. The main point here is that no culture is a monolith. They change due to time, technology, environmental factors, and most of all, their neighbors. With that, I think we've about covered the topic of world-building cultures. Hopefully this video has been interesting or helpful to you, and I'd love to hear about your favorite fantasy cultures, either from your own worlds or from a world you love. So thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing, and remember, Australians and Austrians are not the same thing.